Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 5 of this wonderful book, The Story of Art Without Men, by Katie Hessel, a book that readdresses the balance of art history that up until now has been mostly told from a male perspective with male artists, and we now get to enjoy the history of art exclusively through the perspective of female artists. We start this next part off with a chapter on queer identities. Here's a quote from Claude Cahun. Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that suits me. So in the early decades of the 20th century, ideas around gender types became the subject of much fascination. Representations of queerness and the same sex desire flourished, with artists using their own image to assert nuanced identities that didn't fit into society's rigid binary gender categories. Shaving their heads, wearing trouser suits, some women artists would go on to change their names to masculine or gender non-conforming ones, signalling the identity they had chosen for themselves. Poets Edith Cooper and Catherine Bradley took the single name of Michael Field. Marjorie Moss became Marlowe Moss. Hannah Gluckstein became Gluck. Lucy Schwab became Claude Cahun, as the quote was from. And self-fashioning was integral to queer artists' identities, as an abundance of carefully constructed photographs, self-portraits and portraits show us. So although known for painting androgynous self-portraits, Gluck also commissioned photographers to take images of them dressed in a sharp tailored suit, radiating confidence. And similarly, the American Paris-based painter Romaine Brooks challenged traditional depictions of women through her commanding grey-toned portraits, which recall historical, heroic representations of men. Clothes were an important way of drawing attention to one's sexual identity, but this particular style was soon adopted as the high fashion of the day. Although there are many examples of queer artists throughout this book, such as Rosa Bonheur, Marie Laurencin, Hannah Hock, to name a few, here the author wants to spotlight artists working at the height of the European avant-garde who explicitly use their work to make bold statements about same-sex desire, declarations mostly suppressed or ignored in art history. It's not that the author believes that their work should be viewed exclusively through a queer lens, for they were, of course, simply great artists. The author uses the word queer for its inclusive connotations, and in line with recent discourse, have also referenced to some artists as them and they. And before we explore these representations, let's look at where these artists were working, because during the 1920s, London and Paris were polarized places. Male homosexuality had historically been the subject of much debate and legal scrutiny in Britain. Until 1861, sodomy was punishable by death, and afterwards male homosexuality, even when acts were carried out in private, was a criminal offence. Female homosexuality, by contrast, was hardly ever mentioned. And in 1921, when a Conservative MP suggested in Parliament that all acts of gross indecency by females should be made illegal, the idea was swiftly dismissed for fear the very mention of such acts should lead women astray. Female homosexuality was not unlawful, but it was rather invisible. So yet queer women living in Britain certainly didn't have it easy, either, like the painter Dora Carrington. They were married and had lesbian affairs in private, or if they were open about their sexuality, they were discriminated against. A case in point occurred in 1928, when lesbianism became a public topic of discussion after the publication of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness and Virginia Woolf's Orlando within 3 months of each other. It was the former title that elicited the most extreme reaction. British papers called it a book that must be suppressed. The Well of Loneliness was banned until 1959. To make explicitly queer art in these circumstances was radical. One of the foremost artists of the time, Gluck, grew up in a wealthy conservative Jewish family who disapproved of their child's artistic ambitions and androgynous look. At the age of 23, Gluck insisted that their name be reproduced with no prefix, suffix or quotes. Gluck studied art in London before escaping to the small coastal village of Lamorna in Cornwall, where the Newlands School Artist Colony was based. Unlike London, where social expectations had been stifling, Lamorna gave Gluck the freedom to dress and be as they chose, and to live openly with their then partner, known as Craig. Here's Gluck, photograph left by Howard Costa. So cool. Gluck often painted friends, such as Ernest Thesiger here. Wonderful sense of scale there. Memorialising queer men and women and hinting at their vulnerability. Particularly moving, the author thinks, is this portrait of Ernest Thesiger, a married homosexual man known to perform in drag, which shows him spotlighted on a stage with a thin shadow reflecting his tense body, accentuating his isolation. And Gluck portrayed Ernest as he would have been accepted by society, in the same suit outfit that would have emotionally suffocated him. And living openly with women, Gluck was commercially successful and even developed their distinctive three-tiered Gluck frame to house their pictures. In the 30s, they produced paintings of meticulous floral arrangements, prepared by former lover and expert gardener Constance Spry. However, Gluck soon became involved with the married, wealthy American socialite Nestor Obama, represented in the double portrait medallion, UE, 1936. That's another great image, isn't it? That's so powerful. One of the first visibly sapphic statements in Western art, this revolutionary double portrait, supposedly inspired by a Night at the Opera, represents Gluck and Nestor side by side in profile, bound together by their love. Nestor's golden hair framing Gluck's like a halo. Although they are united, there is a remoteness to them. Gluck, who is closer to us, appears tense. Nestor, looking upwards into the distance, is bathed in a celestial light, as if untouchable, with Gluck attempting to hold on to her. Despite their bond, the relationship deteriorated in the early 1940s, and in the self-portrait Gluck, the artist is staring down, defiant and in command, yet there is also sadness in their expression, lines of tension visible on their face, lips pursed, collar turned upwards as if it were shielded against pain. One could also read this pain as British society's rejection of who Gluck wanted to be, free from gender, liberated from society, unclaimed by anyone. And whereas London was dismissive of queer communities, in Paris it was a different story. For one, The Well of Loneliness continued to be published in contrast with the British ban, and known as a haven for queer artists, writers and thinkers in particular. Paris was the setting for a queer community of mostly upper-class women, including art patron Gertrude Stein and writer Natalie Clifford Barney. Barney, famed for her weekly salons, would enter into a 50-year relationship with American painter Romaine Brooks. And like Gluck, Romaine Brooks, born Beatrice Romaine Goddard, explored gender-neutral portrayals, having lived on the island of Capri at the turn of the 1900s. Here's a stunning-looking self-portrait here. Lovely and gothic. Capri was a place where many homosexuals migrated. Brooks moved to Paris in 1905. Here she captured friends and lovers in compelling portraits, ignoring the modernist aesthetics of the day, but presenting her subjects as serious and mighty. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have been just suddenly very taken by this stark image here on the left, which I'm sure we'll hear about in a moment. So using clothes to show off their identity and personality, sharp, tailored suits and cravats swarm with cropped hair and the occasional monocle, as seen in Una, Lady Trowbridge, in 1924. Picturing the lover of Radcliffe Hall, Brooks also presented herself as an independent and unobjectified woman. In self-portrait, as we saw previously, she's staring directly at us from the shadow of her top hat, a subtle hint of red paint for her lips and cheeks, emblematic of the androgynous new woman. Having escaped the Russian Revolution in 1917, Tamara de Lempinka found herself at the centre of a lively Parisian life and constructed some of the most radical, liberal and avant-garde images of the same-sex desire. melding meticulous painting techniques found in Renaissance painting with cold and shiny Art Deco aesthetics. De Lempicka's paintings feel almost metallic in style as they ooze the momentous spirit of the fast-paced age. Referencing popular art historical compositions, her highly erotic group of four nudes fuses elements of the Baroque, its high drama and industrialism, the robust semi-cubist figures, their angular cheekbones and silvery eyes. Nicknamed the Baroness with the Brush, and known for being able to work for 9 hours straight, breaking only for baths and champagne, De Lempicka epitomized the modern woman and painted her lifestyle and the exuberance of the Jazz Age. Sexually free, twice married, openly bisexual, for her self-portrait, De Lempicka depicted herself fittingly holding the wheel of a Bugatti, cloaked in a marble-like scarf. Although known as a writer in 1920 surrealist Paris, Claude Cahun explored gender and identity through photographs and self-portraits taken in private with Marcel Moore, the artist's stepsister and later lover and collaborator, presenting themselves as an angel, an aviator, or as fictional and fairy tale characters. Cahun used performance to allude to their many selves and alter egos and refused to conform to society's gender binaries. In their words, under this mask, another mask, I will never finish removing all these faces. Born to a wealthy intellectual Jewish family, Cahun began experimenting with the camera in the early 1910s, and in subsequent years they shaved their head and dressed androgynously, tantalizingly documenting their transformation through photography. For decades, Cahun employed photographic techniques such as superimposing images and mirrors, as if to present two versions of themselves. Witnessing the rise of anti-Semitism and fascism in Europe, in 1937, Cahun and Moore made their escape by hopping across the Channel to Jersey, a place they had visited as children. Known by the locals as Les Madames, they walked their cats on leads and made striking performative images, dressing in costume, playing with backdrops, incorporating found objects. Seeing these works, which are minute in scale, is like stumbling into the private life of a couple who embraced theatricality. Here is Claude Cahun in Le Mystère d'un Homme, and a self-portrait reflected in a mirror, 1928. But these images came to an end when German forces occupied the island. Instead of leaving, the pair used their performance skills to become German soldiers, infiltrating marches or to dress as elderly women in order to deliver counter-propagandic messages to Nazis. Wow, that is incredibly brave. 4 years, though, they were able to do this, and they were found out, imprisoned and sentenced to death. Although they were liberated at the end of the war, they were never recovered mentally. So born into a society that wouldn't accept them, the artists exploring queer identities feel contemporary, relevant, and ahead of their time, going against stylistic fashions of the day and certainly not conforming to society's traditional paths for women. They wrote queerness into art history. Without them, and if the British press and government had got their way, we would not know these thriving communities have ever existed. So it makes the author wonder how many other experimental, unknown as of yet artists there were out there, breaking down gender barriers and writing their story into an art history that itself only now is being written. It's a very good point, as this book is all about. That brings us on to the next chapter, the aftermath of the First World War, between 1920 and 1940. We start with Dada, the Ready-Made, and the Weimar era. So in the aftermath of the First World War, of course Europe was scarred by political chaos and the horrors that had been witnessed by so many. Millions had been killed, even more wounded. Artists turned to the imagination and the absurd for relief, so Dada was born. An art that refused to define itself, and in the words of its founder, Tristan Tzara, meant nothing. It was more of a philosophy than an actual style, and the artists associated with it were ardently political, protesting the establishment. They injected their work with dark humour and satire, no doubt as a way of dealing with the madness of the time. originating in 1916 in Zurich, where Sophie Taube-Arp and Emmy Hennings were known for their expressive performances at the Cabaret Voltaire. Dada was international in its influence, reaching Berlin, Munich, Paris, and New York. Responding to the era's catastrophic events, the women of Dada were fearless, unafraid to poke fun at political leaders and caricature their male contemporaries. Experimental and egalitarian, they viewed art as integral to everyday life. Working across collage, painting, poetry, performance, they also sought out a new type of art known as ready-made. This was a radically disruptive medium, which saw artists place manufactured objects as artworks in museums, questioning the value of artistic skill and the very essence of what art could be. Hannah Hoch, in the author's opinion, was the most important Berlin Dada artist. She adopted a distinct feminist and queer persistence in her art, and reacted to the time through satirical photographic montages, and engaged with contemporary social and political issues and shone a light on the oppression of women. Their inventive and brilliantly punchy visual language spliced together images and text from journals, newspapers, fashion magazines, and gave a voice to those often dismissed. Trained in painting, glasswork, embroidery, and patterning, Hoch initially produced a series of disturbing yet playful Dada dolls in pairs of same-sex couples. By 1918, she had joined forces with the Berlin Dada group, and taking photo montage as her medium, 1 year later she started on her most ambitious and explosively political work, cut with the Dada kitchen knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany. What a name! In Cut with a Kitchen Knife, she collates fractured images to depict the disjointed reality of the era's political chaos. The kitchen, in the title, references women's stereotypical roles. So swept up in the form of a macho and almost disintegrating machine, the different elements are presented as cogs attempting to turn the wheel of a lost and broken world. A collage of the faces and bodies of politicians, artists, and other notable figures from recent journals, as if to root the work in the contemporary moment. The piece is split into 4. The densely packed top right corner is emblazoned with the words "Die Anti-Dada," symbolizing those against Dada, set against an array of spoofed images of right-wing politicians, such as the slashed face of Kaiser Wilhelm, a significant contributor to the disaster of the First World War. The top left is filled with propagandist references, punctuated with the face of Einstein. The bottom left gives reference to the prominence of the German communist leader Karl Liebknecht and features the text "Join Dada." At the bottom right are members of the Dada group, as well as a map of Europe highlighting countries yet to allow women to vote. To bring the whole picture together as if she were the key cog in the machine, Hoch places the head of artist Kathy Kollwitz at its centre atop a dancing body, perhaps to highlight the strength of women. So capturing the rebellious spirit of the time, Hoch sought to fight gender injustice, raising awareness about women's suffrage and reproductive rights, and has always tempered their work with humour, and in 1920s penned The Painter, a short story about a tormented painter whose wife thwarted the boundless flights of his genius by forcing him to wash the dishes 4 times in 4 years. He is quoted as saying, "The first time actually there had been a pressing reason. She was giving birth to the baby." I wonder how large this work is if you were to see it in person. Stunning. Hoch struck up a close friendship with another acclaimed artist, Sophie Taube-Arp, and famed for her poetry performances. Taube-Arp also worked with puppetry, painting, dance, and interiors, was one of the most foremost artists working with geometric abstraction. Her Dada heads painted wooden sculptures with sharp angles and fragments of mechanical manufactured objects as hair or facial features speak to the era's interest in the ready-made and reflect the optimism and the anxieties brought about by industrial modernity. Although their male contemporary Marcel Duchamp is often credited with inventing the ready-made, after all he did coin the art historical term, there are those who claim that he was in fact predated by a woman, Baroness Elsa von Freytag Lorenhoven, who experimented with found objects and assemblages. According to her friend Jane Heap, editor of the Little Review, she was the only one living anywhere who dresses Dada, loves Dada, lives Dada. Born 15 years prior to Hock and Taube Arp, by the turn of the century, the Baroness already endured a most eventful life. She was raised in a tumultuous household in Prussia, from which she was made to run away to join the European avant-garde. She helped her husband fake his death and arrived in America in 1910, making her way to New York City, which was soon to become the artistic centre of the Western world. She married her third and final husband, a cash-stricken baron, hence her title, and to make ends meet, modelled for Man Ray. She attended salons and befriended Duchamp, who was enraptured by her poetry recitals, fractured lines assembled from slogans known as ready-made poems. He once said of her, "The Baroness is not a futurist, she is the future." So often seeking to shock and provoke, Freytag Loringhoven wandered the streets wearing little but a blanket, tinned tomato cans tied together with string around her chest, hats adorned with gilded carrots and other vegetables, or sometimes spoons, and stamps on her cheeks. She saw these items, often junk on the street, as wearable art. With a shaved head and penchant for cross-dressing, she defied gender conventions and refused to conform to societal expectations. So it's no doubt that her experimental work was in the vanguard of movements that defined the end of the 20th century, such as body and performance art, as her biographer Irene Gamble argues. And indeed, her found objects, assemblages, and junk sculptures of the 1910s changed the course of art history. She produced her first piece, titled Enduring Ornament, in 1913, an old metal ring which she chose to declare as an artwork, a year before Duchamp's bottle rack. An everyday bottle rack that is seen as encapsulating one of the defining art movements in modernism. In 1917, in collaboration with artist Morton Livingston Schoenberg, she created God, a soul metal plumbing trap, which was previously wrongly attributed to the male artist alone, but her biggest snub was yet to come. If you've ever heard of Duchamp's Fountain from 1917, one of the most famous works of art, some might say an icon of 20th century art, which helped kickstart modern art, after the Ready-Made, signed under the pseudonym Armut, had been scandalously rejected by the Society of Independent Artists, an organisation which prized itself on progressiveness. Duchamp penned a rather telling letter to his sister Suzanne, writing, "One of my female friends, under a masculine pseudonym Richard Mutt, sent in a porcelain urinal as a sculpture. Despite its rejection, the object was photographed by Alfred Stieglitz, who also claimed that the author of the radical piece was a woman. A clue, perhaps suggesting that it may have been submitted by the Baroness, is that Duchamp's details on procuring his urinal are hazy. He claimed the urinal was from J.L. Mott Ironworks, when it turns out they have no record of the product. I'll leave it up to you to decide, but the Baroness's exclusion from art history strikes me as utterly unjust, considering she was making junk sculptures before Duchamp. No wonder she called him Marcel Duchamp." But the tragic fact is that she never received any recognition during her lifetime, and by 1922 she was penniless and broken, loathed America. Returning to an even more turbulent Berlin, the Baroness suffered from depression and lived on the streets. She went to Paris in 1926, where she died, some say by her own hand, just 1 year later. That's incredibly sad. There she is, in her Dada clothing. Fantastic character. Jean Mamin in 1975 says, "I've always wanted to be just a pair of eyes." Jean Mamin. "I've always wanted to be just a pair of eyes, walking through the world unseen, only to see others." So like the turbulent Berlin the Baroness returned to, Germany in the interwar period was a time of extreme paradoxes. While the First World War and the collapse of the German Empire had left the country shattered, society under the new democratic Weimar Republic led to a new era of social liberalism. German cities were rife with cultural optimism, and artists captured the vibrancy and turmoil of an exciting, restructuring new nation. And opportunities had never been greater for women. Entering the workforce while women were at battle, some had their first taste of independence and thrived. And since 1919, women could vote, and legislation around birth control had loosened. It was now finally acceptable for them to roam the German streets unchaperoned. The new woman was born. She is provocative and androgynous, dancing in nightclubs or performing in cabarets and defying gender conventions. Although short-lived due to the rise of Nazism, this period redefined what had been German artistic identity, energizing the art world and producing some of the greatest, most forward-thinking works of the early 20th century. With her cropped hair and trouser suits, Jeanne Mamen epitomized the modern woman, embracing same-sex desire in her vibrant Berlin nightclub scenes. Successful, radical, and a cunning observer of the day, regularly publishing her satirical drawings in magazines, she depicted women who were bold, glamorous, sensual, and free, and her images erupt with colour, rhythm, and movement. You can almost sense the pounding music in her jazz-fueled scenes. As seen here, she represents. There's great movement to that piece. So returning from Paris to Berlin in 1921, where she captured the glitz, glamour, and raucousness of the avant-garde, Mamen documented all-female dancing crowds, sharp-eyed, stylish in their top hats and waistcoats. And in the watercolour she represents, queer women are pictured oozing with confidence and effervescent playfulness. And although at the time German laws disallowed same-sex relationships, transporting us to the hectic, lively nights, Mamen nevertheless also conveys the gritty reality of Weimar life in her paintings of prostitutes getting ready for work under an electrically lit midnight sky. Mamen's contemporary Lotte Laserstein also poignantly explored gender and identity through paint, and although her style feels romantic and traditional, her subject matter is far ahead of her time. At the height of the Weimar era, she was bound for an incredible career. Laserstein began her artistic endeavours in Berlin, where she established a studio in 1927, painting weighty, breathable, meticulously rendered bodies. Her work was soon met with acclaim, and she exhibited both in Germany and more widely in Europe. Breaking down gender stereotypes, she adopted an androgynous look with her cropped hair and mannish shirt, as seen in her self-analytical and, as the author likes to think, vulnerable self-portrait with a cat. She often used her friend Trata Rose as a model, producing intimate and complex nudes that were full of sensuality and eroticism. In At the Mirror, a boyish-looking, naked female figure, its muscular back turned to us, is gazing intently at its reflection. Bathed in dappled sunlight set to the right, we see the artist, perhaps Laserstein herself, immersed in the moment, dancing between canvas and mirror, hurriedly squeezing paint onto her palette to conquer the canvas in front of her. It's applied so thickly that when you see it in person, it is as though the canvas has become Laserstein's palette. And this is a painting full of tension between artist and model, artist and viewer. And like her peers, Laserstein symbolised the new woman, but just when her career was taking off, everything stopped. In 1934, after being declared a three-quarter Jew, she was banned from exhibiting in public. Oh dear. With the rise of Nazi power, her work, like that of many other defiant artists, was forced into obscurity. In 1937, she emigrated to Sweden, where she remained for the rest of her life, her career never reaching the same heights after the war. Labelled degenerate by Hitler for not conforming to his German nationalistic ideology and instead embracing expression and modernity, modernist art was banned and sometimes even destroyed. The Nazis seized more than 15,000 works, and in 1937 staged two degenerate art exhibitions in Munich, featuring the likes of Mamen, Laserstein, Modersohn Becker, and Hock. Although the exhibitions were staged to explicitly mock these artists, what they did in fact was to put on public view some of the most revolutionary works in history, works that spoke truth to both the freedom and tumult of the age and captured women in their modern and triumphant glory, accepted, liberated, and encapsulating freedom. What a strange strategy to actually place what you're outlawing in an exhibition for the public to view. It's very confident in your ability to control the masses, which I suppose they were up until the Second World War. Bauhaus, of course a big movement that many of us are familiar with, and here's Annie Albers in 1968 stating that I find art is something that gives you something that you need for your life, just as religion is something that you need, even if you constantly find it denied today. One of the most influential and radical art and design schools to emerge during the Weimar era was the Bauhaus, building house in English. Bauhaus stripped out expressive artistry, enforcing function over form, and inaugurated in 1919 in Weimar until 1925, then Dessau 1925-32, and Berlin 1933. The Bauhaus offered a utopian direction in artistic education, emphasizing regeneration and renewal, and promoting machine work. The school taught painting, sculpture, architecture, and textiles, and in their words, above all, a modern philosophy of design. It was open to students of any gender, age, or class, and initially focused on the basics of each discipline. This was known as the preliminary course, as outlined by its founder, Walter Gropius, and is still the standard foundation course taught in art schools today. Funded by the Weimar government, the school ran for 14 years. Although it prided itself on offering a wide-ranging education and eliminating hierarchies across subjects and media, the school was far from equal. While men were free to experiment, women were mostly shut away in the weaving and bookbinding workshops. Gropius even proclaimed that women thought in 2 dimensions, whereas men thought in 3. So women responded by monopolizing and dominating weaving and bookbinding and innovating new techniques. Their influence on the weaving industry is felt to this day. Here are some students of the weaving workshop at a loom in 1928. So for the 22-year-old Gunther Stolz, who enrolled in the school the year it was founded, Bauhaus was the path to another world. A new life begins, she recorded in her journal. One of the most successful weavers to come out of the school, and one of the few women to hold a managerial position there. Stolz free-weaved textile seats, curtains, carpets, and wall hangings, and was an influential teacher to Annie Albers, who praised her experimentalism. Annie Albers was a loom trailblazer, becoming a student at the Bauhaus in 1922 after what she described as an unsatisfactory experience at an applied art school in Germany. She was initially reluctant to join the weaving workshop due to its lack of prestige. However, she became soon enraptured by the material, later recalling these amazing objects striking in their newness of conception in regards to the use of colour and compositional elements. Using threads to experiment for both functional and artistic purposes, Albers designed pieces that were not just useful and innovative, but also with their geometric rhythmic patterning and electric colouring visually arresting, as seen in Wall Hanging of 1926. One of her breakthrough pieces was the sound-absorbing, light-reflecting wall-covering fabric she designed for the auditorium of Hannes Meyer. For this, she developed techniques to use the newly invented material cellophane, which she received in 1930, a Bauhaus diploma. What's really interesting here is, this might seem very crude to say, but how influential is this in our modern day lives? If you think about the public transport that uses about this style of weaving and pattern on tube seats, subway seats, train, buses. It's Bauhaus. Very interesting. So unlike Albers and Stolz, Gertrude Arndt first joined the Bauhaus to study architecture. However, the hostility of her male peers made this unsustainable, so she reluctantly enrolled for the weaving course, in which she excelled. She went on to marry a fellow Bauhaus student and took up photography out of boredom, according to her daughter, but clearly with the experimental and productive Bauhaus spirit. Not exhibited until long after the Second World War, Arndt's extraordinary photographs reveal a woman intrigued by disguise, dressing up as different characters in a flamboyant array of costumes and hats. Here's Maskenfoto Dessau. Great character, great fun. She performed for the camera in a way to explore female identity. And in an interview in the 1990s, she recalled, "You just need to open your eyes and already you are someone else." There were so many other female artists at that time. Marianne Brandt, who photographed herself in mirror balls, distorting her body and her surroundings, in addition to designing low-level stylish metal teapots and desk lamps. Fantastic here. Her number 15 Candem table lamp, 1928, was the most commercial object to emerge from the entire Bauhaus. Photographer Lucia Moholy and weavers Otti Berger and Benita Otte. But by 1933, the Bauhaus had been shut down by the Nazis. The work carried out there had been revolutionary, and although women faced constant misogyny, they rose above it and excelled. Some of them, those lucky enough not to fall into the clutches of the Nazi regime, went on to achieve greatness. Albers headed up the weaving workshop at Black Mountain College, and Stoltz fled to Switzerland and founded a successful hand-weaving business. Like the revolutionary artists working alongside them in Dada or Weimar, Germany, not all survived, but their legacy does. The 1930 publication Die Woche, The Week, described the Bauhaus girl type as a woman who was ambitious, talented, creative, and free, not unlike the New Woman, in fact. A type that became popular all over the world, inspired the next generation, and continues to have currency today. And I feel sufficiently inspired to put a pin in that part for today, and I look forward to having you join me for more stories of art without men. Until then, goodbye.